Welcome to episode 2 of the 5th season of Decision Points. I'm David Makovsky, the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and I'm happy to go on this journey with you. In this episode, we will zoom out this time from Gaza and dive into another urgent front. Israel is facing the possibility of an all-out war with Hezbollah on its northern border. Recently, the Yemeni Houthis fired a drone strike on Tel Aviv, and it was a stark reminder that Israel is fighting a war on 7 fronts, albeit with different levels of intensity, but 7 fronts: Gaza, Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and the West Bank. This was the dream of Sinwar. He always spoke of a ring of fire around Israel. The volatile regional landscape is propelled by Iran, the proverbial head of the octopus, and Hezbollah's primary backer. On Israel's northern border, the IDF has been fighting Hezbollah, the Shiite terror group that runs Lebanon, since October the 8th. Since that time, Hezbollah has fired some 7,000 rockets and missiles into Israel, forcing the continued evacuation and displacement of 80,000 residents from Israel's northern communities. And we should say there's been a lot of devastation also on the Lebanese side of the border as well. Hezbollah has always posed a far greater strategic threat to Israel than Hamas. Hezbollah has 40,000 fighters and an arsenal of more than 150,000 rockets, drones, and missiles, many of them precision-guided. These munitions could hit virtually any major city in Israel. All-out war with Hezbollah would put Israel's resources under strain. Such a war would likely require American buy-in to ensure that Israel has the munitions it needs to defend itself. Aside from the resource strain, Israel's soldiers are tired, its northern residents are frustrated, and its international support is on a ticking clock. Hezbollah has linked its actions in the north to the situation in Gaza, declaring that it will stop firing rockets into Israel when a ceasefire is reached between Israel and Hamas. The US, France, and other allies have been working tirelessly to broker a diplomatic agreement between Israel and Hezbollah before tensions escalate to the point of no return. A de-escalation plan could take the form of UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which was intended to resolve the 2006 Israel-Lebanon war. However, many have pointed out the flaws in this resolution when it comes to enforcement and implementation. Is an all-out war with Hezbollah inevitable? What will it take to deliver peace for the long term? What will it take to persuade people on both sides who are displaced to return to their homes? To explore these questions and more, I'm delighted to be joined by 2 expert analysts on today's episode, Amos Harel and Hanin. Amos is the military correspondent for Haaretz and is one of Israel's leading experts on military and defense issues. He won the Sokolov Prize for print journalism in 2015 and has written extensively about Hezbollah and the 2006 Lebanon War. Amos is also the author of 3 books, including the co-author of 34 Days, Israel, Hezbollah, and the War in Lebanon. Hanin is the Friedman Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute. Her work at the Institute focuses largely on Shia politics throughout the Levant, including Lebanon. Hanin is a native of Al-Razia, a town in southern Lebanon. She has decades of experience in print journalism. She was the longtime managing editor of Lebanon's Now newspaper and has written extensively on the evolution of Hezbollah inside Lebanon. Amos and Hanin, welcome to Decision Points. So, Amos, maybe I'll start with you. How do you see the state of play between Israel and the Lebanon border? How much devastation is on each side? Do we see a pattern to the violence?
Well, for the time being, the Lebanon-Israeli border is still a sideshow. Gaza is the main deal. We still don't know what would happen regarding the results of Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit in Washington. But it seems that there's still a chance to reach a hostage deal between Israel and Hamas within the next few weeks. And I think this will have a massive effect on whatever goes on between Israel and Hezbollah on the Lebanese border. What we see right now is mostly destruction and some death on both sides. Hezbollah and Israel swapping blows daily, almost every hour, most days. And yet, it's rather limited. The rules of the game are pretty much well known to both sides. Hezbollah does not aim most of its fire towards civilians. It does try to hit either military targets or villages and kibbutzim and so on, which were deserted by their inhabitants on October 8th. While Israel keeps to its own rules of engagement and focuses on Hezbollah. Most of what we see happens about 5 to 10 miles away from the border. And yet, this remains extremely dangerous because we've seen periods of escalation in the past, and every time that Israel hits something that Hezbollah sees as a major target, whether it's a top commander, a senior official, a weapons depot, which is important for Hezbollah, the reaction may be stronger. So there's always this chance of miscalculation, whether one side hits by mistake a target for which the price is too high, the human price is too high, or if one blow turns to another on the other side, then suddenly you're in another position that you didn't intend to go there. And we've seen that in the past. There were a few brief periods of massive escalation, which almost led to a full-scale war for the time being, as far as I can see, and maybe Hanin thinks otherwise. But I don't see any real intention on either side to reach a full-scale war on this border.
All right, so the Hanin, pick up on that point, which is to American listeners and other listeners around the world, it sounds strange. On one hand, what we hear is neither side wants a war, yet war can happen. Is that because in the Middle East, people don't know exactly where the brink is? Why is it this gap between what we hear that neither side wants war and that the fear that yet war could break out? Why does neither side want war as you see it?
Thank you, David. I agree with most of what Amos has said, so I'm not going to repeat the same points because we're in agreement on this. I just would like to add about, just to answer your question about why we haven't seen a real escalation so far. So despite the escalation since October 8th, when Hezbollah started its attack against Israel, we have seen some escalation in the quality of weapons that Hezbollah has used, for example, the explosive drones, and escalation in terms of hitting deeper into Israel, for example, than just, the northern areas. And according to our mapping project that we're doing, like mapping the escalations on most borders for the Washington Institute, we see these escalations happening at certain cross points where there's tension with the Iranians, for example, or there's tension over the negotiations or a deal. There's always an escalation, but also it has been calculated. Despite all these escalations on the ground, it has been extremely calculated. Definitely both sides, as Amos said, do not want war because I think I'm not going to speak on the behalf of the Israelis. It's not my expertise, but I think the Israelis are still busy in Gaza. They need more time to prepare for the Lebanon's war, and they need the Americans to be ready to support a bigger, probably larger war in Lebanon. So this is probably not going to happen before the elections and to see who's coming next. But I can talk more about Hezbollah's calculations. Hezbollah, since 2006, which is the last war Hezbollah had with Israel, their mission has changed drastically. With Qasem Soleimani, the IRGC commander, the Quds Force commander, who actually is out of the picture now, he was assassinated, but he changed Hezbollah's mission in the region, the core of Hezbollah's mission, where Hezbollah was more focused on the south of Lebanon, on fighting Israel, on taking over Lebanon's decision-making. Today, with Qasem Soleimani and the IRGC, they are today a huge part of the Quds Force, the IRGC. They are the IRGC's regional main component, actually. And this changes their mission from protecting the borders or supporting the Palestinians or Gaza to become the insurance policy and the front line of the Iranians. Their job is to protect Iranian interests. That is, if Iran feels that its regime and its nuclear program are under attack or under direct threat, then Hezbollah will be really unleashed. That's why we haven't seen Hezbollah today using most of their strategic and advanced weapons. Today, we have seen Hezbollah using a lot of missiles, short-range missiles, some drones, but they still have the precision missiles, guided missiles. They still have a lot that they haven't used. And they haven't called really the reserves in order to, launch a war. So the leader of Hezbollah, in his first speech, which was delayed, the first thing he said in his first speech, that this is a Palestinian war. This is a war that we are going to support for the Palestinians to win their war. He means Hamas. This is Hamas' job. We are not going to be part of it because this war for them is about Hamas. It's not about Iran. They support it, but they're not going to sacrifice what they have, their assets, in order to support Hamas. They will need these assets to support Iran. That's why they have been very, very calculated. There are other components to this. They do have challenges. They do have the budget for war, but for a short war, not for a long war. They do not have the budget for reconstruction. I'm not talking about the reconstruction of Lebanon. They don't care. I'm talking about the reconstruction of their military infrastructure and their own community, which is not the Shia community. And they have a commandment issue. Who is going to command this war? After Qasem Soleimani, Imad Mughniye, Mustafa Badruddin, and the few others that Israel has targeted in this war, they really are lacking a commander with a vision to lead this war. Very clear calculations that their assets will only be used to protect Iran and its interests, not Hamas.
What we have learned, and I know you follow this so closely, the relationship between Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, and Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, we hear is very close. That the supreme leader sees Nasrallah, and to put it in Israel's terms, like, you're the head of the Northern Command. You're on the spot. You know the Israelis better than I do in Iran. They have a very close personal relationship that Nasrallah could contact him directly and bypass the whole Iranian bureaucracy, that they're very tight. But at the same time, he seems like he's got a view of Nasrallah, the supreme leader, which goes like this. Your job, my man, is to be my insurance policy. I don't want the Israelis hitting my nuclear program. If they don't hit my nuclear program, you're not going to deplete your whole arsenal for these Sunni Hamas people. You will offer support. I give you great latitude in terms of border skirmishes, and they hit your guy, and you make the Israelis pay, and I get that, and I give you great latitude. But no all-out war against the Jews unless they hit the nuclear program. Am I reading it correctly?
This is a great summary of everything I said. And I would add to this as well that Hassan Nasrallah is not just the Lebanese proxy of Khamenei. All these militias in Iraq and Syria and Hamas and others, and even Houthis at one point, they're like proxies, clients. Hezbollah is not a proxy. When Hezbollah started in the south, we all know how it started. It didn't start as a Lebanese faction that got support from Khamenei and the IRGC. They started as part of the IRGC built in the region. They are part of the Quds Force. So the decision-making, it's not like Khamenei tells Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah what to do, and Hassan Nasrallah obliges. It's not like an order that comes in. Khamenei is the big boss, of course, but they are part of the institution. And the IRGC and the Quds Force, which is very different from the Lebanese political parties, it's an institution. And the decision-making comes from the institution. And Hassan Nasrallah and the Lebanese Hezbollah leaders, the Lebanese because they only hold the Lebanese passports, but Iran's interests are their interests. It's not Lebanon. They all think together and make the decision together. So it's just wanted to make this clear distinction between what Hezbollah is for the Iranians and what the other proxies are.
And they're clearly the jewel in Iran's crown. They have this ring of fire. We keep hearing about the 7 fronts, and more recently was the Houthi strike on Tel Aviv, and Israel hit back. We've seen back and forth, but Hezbollah has got a special place in the Iranian ecosystem. Given what we heard from Hanin, what is realistic now? And it is striking that Israel's Northern Command, and the Northern Command does not exist independently from the Chief of Staff, the Defense Minister, the Prime Minister. Israel is going after these Hezbollah guys, and they know each time. I mean, if you lived in the north and you heard on Israel radio, Israel just hit a key Hezbollah commander of Lebanon. A lot of these people are going to the shelters, right? Because Hezbollah is going to hit back. You kind of know that there's a pattern to this. What does Israel think, short of a war, What is attainable? And the core question for me is always, how do we get people on both sides of the border to go back to their homes, to believe that they're safe? But at the core, what does Israel think it could achieve in these, what started as border skirmishes, but has really evolved and has gone far from the border? Israel's hit the Bekaa Valley. Hezbollah has hit other places in northern Israel. How do you look at this evolution from Israel's military point of view?
I would suggest that to some extent, this is a matter of frustration. A lot of these attacks, not everything is decided by the Northern Command, by the way. The Northern Command or the intelligence branch may suggest one form of attack or another, and the final decision is made by HQ. And it could be approved by Netanyahu or Gallant or the War Cabinet or the current Security Cabinet. It depends on the target, how highly important it is, and what the possible outcome is. When we look at the assassinations, and of course Hanin is right to point out that a few of these commanders were killed, at least 3 significant senior commanders of Hezbollah were assassinated during the last 9 months. So of course it has some influence over Hezbollah's performance, and it may affect Hezbollah's performance if indeed a full-scale war breaks out. And yet, in my view, this represents, as I said, frustration, because in the end, Israel has made a decision, which perhaps was a mistake in retrospect, to order 60,000 border communities residents up to 3 miles away from the border to evacuate on October 8th. They may not have thought this till the end. Nobody figured that this would take more than 9 months, and that people could not go home, and that, for instance, kids could not be registered to study in schools in those communities next year in September. And this includes towns like Kiryat Shmona or Metula, which are, by Israeli standards, towns, major places with lots of people living there. Out of this frustration, you need to do something. You see Hezbollah launching a barrage of rockets every day. You see Nasrallah speaking every now and then and talking about the loss of Israel's deterrence, about how Hamas is presumably so successful at fighting Israel bravely in Gaza, and so on. And these senior commanders, in the end, need to do something. This is the way militaries think, and they have to act. They cannot just sit there and watch as their countrymen are being bombarded. And then you start looking for targets. One important target is, of course, hitting those senior commanders, but that's hard to do. It happens every now and then, and you need to get approval. Another important target is to try and hit military infrastructure in all of those villages and towns near the border. And you've asked before what kind of damage actually happened. This is massive damage. Israel tends to focus on what happened to our towns, and Israelis are angry over this. The Israeli public hardly sees the damage on the other side of the border, and it is massive. The system is to hit Hezbollah where it hurts and to take away some of its military capabilities in case a final full-scale war breaks out. As Hanin has said, Hezbollah is not using its strategic weapons for the time being, and neither does Israel. Israel is focused on very, very specific targets. You don't see a massive wave of attacks every day in which dozens of F-35s and F-15s take part. It doesn't happen yet. It's very far from a massive war. The question is, do you reach deterrence? How much damage can you bring to the other side? And does it have a massive effect? The problem, the tragedy from the Israeli planners or decision makers' perspective right now is that all of these tactical advantages, and for instance, if you compare losses, casualties on each side, there are close to 30 Israeli casualties and more than 450 military men, both Hezbollah and Palestinian guerrillas or terrorists killed on the other side. So the numbers, it's about a ratio of about 1 to 15. But it doesn't add up. In the end, it doesn't mean that Israel has a strategic advantage. What you see is another miserable draw. And of course, the Israeli public expects much more. It expects either a victory, or when you talk about the border communities, the residents, they want to go home to their homes. Many of these houses are destroyed by now. I think more than 1,000 houses and buildings were hit since the beginning of the war. So this is the source of the unrest in the Israeli public regarding that. Whenever you talk to Israelis about the Lebanese border, most of them would like to avoid a war, but we're concerned. How do we figure this out? How do we get out of this situation? And there's a strong level of solidarity here, perhaps stronger than in Lebanon, with the border residents. And people are saying we need to get them back. We need them to live safely in their homes. But how can you do that considering what has happened, considering Hezbollah's military strength, And of course, considering October 7th on the Gaza border, after you've seen that trauma of terrorists crossing the border so easily, and of course, Radwan forces are much stronger than the Nukhba forces down south, how do you live peacefully and safely with your family about a mile away from the border? This is the reality in most of these communities. So I think many people would have a very hard time coming back without the IDF attempting to solve the military problem.
So Radwan is the Hezbollah commandos, not to be confused with Nukhba, the Hamas commandos. The fear of Israelis up to October 7th is that Radwan was right at the border, and you could see their binoculars and everything as they looked into Israel. Key cities have been hurt in Israel, have been really taking a lot of severe hits, in places like Metula, Manara, Kiryat Shmona, places that people know, and this is on the nightly news every single night about the attacks. Lebanon has also had devastation as well, and we'll talk about that. But almost if there is a war, could you give a sense of what it looks like? From what I was told, a lot of Hezbollah's infrastructure is between the Litani and the Awali rivers in southern Lebanon. There are 6 or 7 Hezbollah bases below the Litani. Israelis are also more... Their thinking has shifted a little bit when they say total victory. They hear the words when it comes to Gaza. They know, look, there might be individual Hamas people, but they want to deal Hezbollah a crippling blow that they not consider an October 7th-like situation, or they stay away from the border. We keep thinking that even if there is a military advantage by Israel in pushing Hezbollah out, it won't be the end of Hezbollah, and you're going to be left with some sort of messy diplomatic outcome, some believe. Explain, what do the military thinkers in Israel think war can achieve? What is realistic if there was a war? I'm not saying Israelis are trying to go for a war. Many want to avoid the war. You get a lot of people, reservists, saying we need you rested up because we're going to need you for a war in the north. But yet the leadership like Netanyahu and Gallant, even Halevi, I think more recently, it sounds like it's a different tone. War is something they don't want, but if there is a war, what does it look like and what could it achieve?
First of all, I don't think there's such a thing as a limited war. What we have right now is less than war, but the other 2 alternatives are either a ceasefire, a complete ceasefire in which things go relatively back to normal across the border on both sides, or a full-scale war that we've discussed. The belief among some military planners that you can go through an extensive but short period of, let's say, 6 to 8 days of heavy bombardments on Hezbollah without Hezbollah reacting and launching rockets and missiles towards Tel Aviv and Haifa, especially after the Houthi attacks from Yemen, I don't think that this is realistic. I think that if Israel decides to turn this up, the result would be escalation on both sides, and it wouldn't be limited, and it will take time for the world to intervene. And the end result would probably be a massive war. Now, if there is a war, the question is, what can Israel actually do? I don't think that we will see Israeli tanks breaking forwards towards Beirut. This is not 1982. Hezbollah is much stronger, much more sophisticated, much better trained than the PLO in 82. And the Israeli army is different as well. And the Israeli army, as we know, although the massive ground incursions into Gaza, the balance of power is different between Israel and Hezbollah when you compare that to Israel and Hamas. With Israel and Hamas, since the beginning of November, it was very clear that whenever an Israeli armored division decided on a maneuver inside Gaza, nothing could stop it. With Hezbollah, perhaps it's not the case. You've mentioned the Litani River, and those of your listeners who are less familiar with the map, the Litani River is closer to the Israeli border. The Awali River is to the north of the Litani. The war would focus, if it happens, on what used to be called the security zone, the Israeli self-maintained or self-declared security zone in the 1980s and the 1990s, which is between the border and the Litani. In the west, it's closer to 20 miles. In the east, it's closer to 5 to 7 miles wide. But this is the playing field, if you'd like. This is where the Israeli ground forces would concentrate. The other thing they'll do, of course, is standoff attacks, whether using the Air Force, and this is where Israel has the upper hand, or using artillery, tanks, missiles, whatever. And Israel would concentrate on that. But as you've noted, this would not mean a decisive victory. As you know, we are having a very hard time, in spite of what the Prime Minister is saying for a long time, we're having a very hard time reaching a final victory over Hamas. There's no final victory over Hezbollah. What you can do is hurt Hezbollah and perhaps Lebanese civilian infrastructure, state infrastructure, unfortunately, in a very, very massive way. Hope that the Israeli home front doesn't suffer as much. Hope that the military casualties on the Israeli side are rather limited, and hope that once you reach a ceasefire with international intervention, Israel's position would be better than it was before, meaning that perhaps we can force the hand of Hezbollah to agree to a ceasefire, which would also mean that Hezbollah forces would stay north of the Litani River. I don't need to remind the two of you that the United Nations Security Council decision, Resolution 1701, was exactly about that. It promised that Hezbollah would stay north of the borders, or north of the river, something that never happened, that was never implemented in 2006.
Can Israel fight a war in Lebanon without American munitions? Does it need American buy-in to fight a war with Hezbollah?
Netanyahu would tell you that we will fight with our fingernails and with our teeth, bite the enemy if it's necessary. I think that we need American help. And I think that the Biden administration, as much as I have the utmost respect for the president and for his support to Israel during this very hard time, I think that the Biden administration was not clear-cut about its policies regarding it. There was never a weapons embargo, but was a sort of a dimmer that you could turn up and down. And this is what they were doing for a long time. This was mostly focused on Rafah because the president was afraid that Netanyahu would use massive force and kill too many innocent civilians in Rafah. And this is why the Americans decided not to deliver this specific shipments of 1-ton accurate bombs to the Israeli Air Force. But Israel got over that and managed to beat Hamas in Rafah anyway. This doesn't mean that Israel doesn't need the same kind of munitions to fight Hezbollah. And this is why it's urgent to solve this matter, which hasn't been solved completely, in spite of Defense Minister's gallant visit in Washington recently.
In Lebanon, they see what Israel's doing. How do you think they see a war? I mean, I realize for the Lebanese people, they don't control Hezbollah, and they might feel that they're just bystanders here. Can anyone influence Hezbollah when it comes to war? Can the Lebanese government have any influence? Are they worried that a war would lead to the area of Dahya in Beirut, which we see as a Hezbollah stronghold, being hit? And what about the role of Iran? Do they really think that a war with Israel is going to lead to a regional war driven by the Iranians?
These are all very important questions. And let me just say, what Lebanese government? You mentioned Lebanese government. There's no Lebanese government. This is not a government. There's no state. Let's start with this. There are some spaces of state institutions still functioning just to, manage the internal dynamics. But in terms of the decisions of war and peace, it's all Hezbollah. At the beginning of the war, the Prime Minister, Najib Mikati, said it very clearly, stop asking us to do anything. We can't. There's no way we can ask Hezbollah or influence Hezbollah. He said it very clearly. They are there in order to be the channels. When the U.S. envoy Amos comes to Lebanon, he cannot meet with Hezbollah. He meets with Najib Mikati and Nabih Berri because they are the front of this system. That being said, Hezbollah is the decision maker when it comes to war and peace. The Lebanese people are not bystanders. The Lebanese people are hostages. The Lebanese people tried to protest. The Lebanese people went in 2019 to the streets to say no. And when the slogan of Killun Yani Killun, all of them means all of them, it actually means Hezbollah as part of them. They said no many times. They got beaten. They got killed. And the port explosion really drove everybody back home with severe depressions and hopelessness. So they are hostages. Everybody is a hostage in Lebanon. And they are afraid of a war. Of course, no one wants the war, mainly the Shia community, because it's going to affect them more than anyone else. The difference also between 2006 and today is that the Shia community were supportive of Hezbollah in 2000 and 2006 because they were the resistance and they were still, the mask hasn't fallen yet. Today, the Shia community are silent. They're not protesting because they're afraid. Some of them are benefiting. Some of them are depressed and feeling hopeless, but no one wants the war. No one wants the war. So I think what is happening today is that what's really worrying for Lebanon is that we know that Hezbollah today doesn't store their precision missiles and their advanced weapon only in the south. It's all over the place. We know that. It's mostly in their main areas. But all of Lebanese are worried because they fear that Hezbollah is present even in Christian areas. Who knows? No one knows. The problem was the diplomatic effort to reach a ceasefire. It's very linked to Gaza, right? Hassan Nasrallah said it very clearly that Gaza ceasefire will automatically lead to a Lebanon Hezbollah ceasefire.
You follow probably Nasrallah closer than any person I know of in the Western world. Should the world take Nasrallah at face value? He is a terrorist.
Yes, in this case, you shouldn't believe him at everything he's been saying because lately he's been lying a lot. But in this case, I'd believe him because they are desperate to stop. But it will look very bad if they stop now and let, everything in Gaza continue because they want to regain some of the resistance rhetoric that they have lost. But they are desperate to stop. The main loser in this war between Hezbollah and Israel, I'm not saying Lebanon and Israel, right? The main loser in this is Hezbollah. They have lost more than Lebanon in terms of infrastructure and casualties.
How many fighters do you say?
In terms of commanders, fighters for them are dispensable. They don't care about the fighters. They send them to the front knowing that they're going to die. A lot of them are refusing to go now because they know that they're dispensable. Their commanders are very important. Their military infrastructure, we know that in south of Litani, it has been really damaged. Their weapons facilities, etc. They are losing on a daily basis, and they cannot do much about it because they still believe that Iran is not directly threatened. This is the nightmare that they were afraid of, that the Syria scenario has moved to Lebanon. It's a nightmare because for them, Lebanon was a red line for Israel before October 8, and they don't want, Lebanon to become a Syria scenario. And they have really catered the rhetoric pre-October 7 to make sure that the Israelis are afraid of hitting Lebanon because we will hit back, right? This is a red line, this is a red line. They catered the rhetoric to reach that point, and then everything collapsed. Because we know that they are that desperate and they really want all of this to stop so they can regain their strength, breathe a little bit, restock, regather their forces, they need this to stop. But they need the ceasefire. So in this case, yes, I think he's genuine. But I don't believe him at face value at all, actually. He's been lying to his teeth since Syria. On this issue, yes, they really want this to stop, and you can sense it. When you talk to people on the ground, when you talk to the community, when you talk to former people who left and are still very close to the community and Hezbollah's community, you can tell that they really want this to be over because this is not their war. Again, he said it. This is not our war. The cost for this, support, al-mustanada, what they call it, is too high, and they don't want to lose more.
I remember something you said to me right after October 7th that really stuck with me. You said, look, I monitor social media among the Shia in Lebanon. And you said right after October 7th, it was all about the Mukawama, the resistance, and how people said, we should be all part of the Mukawama. And then the president of the United States, Joe Biden, says, I'm going to send 2 aircraft carriers, including off the coast of Lebanon. And suddenly you said that the social media in Lebanon changed like a light switch. It's like, this is not our war. Hamas didn't coordinate this with us. We don't owe Hamas. It's a case of where when America projects power in the Middle East, this is noticed.
100%. But this is not the Lebanon social media. What we're talking about here is the Hezbollah's social media. We call them the electronic army. They have a very big electronic army. And when you get used to how they work and who they are and the channels, you know exactly who they are. The electronic armies, basically, and I follow some of them on their Telegram channels, and it's the same, everybody, and there was songs of encouraging, Hassan Nasrallah to go for it. The big American no was heard.
When he said don't, they heard that.
They heard that very clearly. And a projection of American power in the Middle East is the only way to stop this. But it has to be continuous. It cannot just be once. It needs to be said again and again and again. And I think Iran heard it first and then Hezbollah.
Amos and Hanin, you will correct me if I get some of the details wrong. It seems that what the U.S. would like, and you have France kind of at the sidelines of this, and I was just in Paris talking to some of their officials, but is basically this idea of You stop, you get a ceasefire pause in Gaza. Hostages, 6 weeks, maybe it's extended. But in that pause, you also stop the spiraling violence in Lebanon, and you create a diplomatic outcome where Hezbollah draws back maybe 10 kilometers, the distance of anti-tank weaponry, removes about 6 or 7 of its bases in southern Lebanon to above that area. And then Israel agrees to some border rectification of some 13 villages, not including Shaba Farms, which is considered very complicated because the Syrians and the Lebanese claim the same piece of land.
It's not villages, David. It's 13 points.
13 points along the border.
Very, very minor areas.
Right. And I was told by a U.S. official we've already solved 6 of them quietly.
Not the controversial
maybe
ones.
not the controversial ones. And I do not think that Hezbollah is asking that all 13 are solved in advance of these border issues. To what extent can diplomacy work here? And what does it take for it to work? Israel and the United States have kind of believed that diplomacy has to be coercive in a certain way, that unless people think that the alternative is maybe war, maybe you won't get to a diplomatic outcome that we all want. I was struck, Amos, I felt, without divulging anything, that even Defense Minister Gallant and the like would like to see a diplomatic outcome. I think the old prime minister used to be known as being very risk averse. And I think when it comes to Lebanon, he seems still to be risk averse. What do you think are the contours of a diplomatic deal? Can it be achieved in the absence of war or only after a war? And how likely is all this?
So I would make the distinction between the actual problems that need to be solved right now and a more serious matter from the Israeli perspective, which is a matter of trust. Nobody trusts Hezbollah on the Israeli side, but do border communities' residents trust the government, and perhaps more significantly, trust the army after the terrible fiasco in the south in October 7th to protect them under the new circumstances? How do you persuade those people to come back and live in their communities? So this is the bigger deal. Unlike the situation in the south, where because of the hostages, we need to make serious concessions there, whether they have to do with withdrawing from certain areas or releasing thousands of prisoners, among them mass murderers. Here, nobody cares about those 13 points. They're not even holy to Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, okay? It's not, most of them are not important sites. These are tiny points, tiny parts of the border that Hezbollah decided to make an issue out of, to use them as an excuse for more provocations during the 24 years since the Israeli evacuation of southern Lebanon. So this could probably be solved. There will be issues regarding the Shaba Farms. There will be issues regarding Hezbollah's presence south of the Litani, but that's not the big deal. The biggest deal is not what would be written in the paper or the non-paper, but what would happen regarding the future. And again, we've had a relative period of unprecedented quiet along the border, relatively speaking. But for 18 years, there were hardly any incidents. And that was after the war, which I define myself, the 2006 war, which I call the miserable draw. And yet, there was enough Israeli deterrence achieved at that time. When Hanin described the situation from the Lebanese perspective, it reminded me in a way of the Israeli perspective of what it's just the opposite. But the Lebanese are frustrated, and so are the Israelis from their side's performance and the casualties and the damage and the destruction and so on. But is that enough? Again, if we look at Hezbollah's capabilities, and this is a serious army of terror, this is probably one of the most well-trained and heavily equipped armies in the region. Can Israelis count on a sort of a status quo to continue for years? You talked of Bibi being risk-averse. What about the residents? This is the main issue. Forgive me for going back to this time after time, but in Israel at least, I'm not sure that the Lebanese government cares so much about the residents. Here, at least for the Israeli public, this is the main issue. Can we trust those people to be protected? And can we please avoid another tragedy such as October 7th? I think that the Israeli public, there's no stamina to go through something like this again, even if it happens in 2 or 3 or 4 years. In spite of all the people that you've mentioned who don't want a war right now, and you're absolutely right about this, whether it's Gallant, who tends to be hawkish about these matters, whether it's Halevi, whether it's Netanyahu himself, There are some generals and some retired generals who are saying, look, guys, we have no choice. Considering the alternative, considering the dangers, considering the worst case scenario in which in 2 or 3 years' time Iran becomes nuclear and it decides to use Hezbollah to finally reach this, I don't know if it's an illusion or a real plan, to defeat Israel, to annihilate Israel completely, we can't afford this to happen. We need to destroy most of Hezbollah's military force. It needs to happen now before they have an Iranian nuclear umbrella. And in spite of the casualties, in spite of the damage, in spite of all those rockets and missiles pointed to Tel Aviv and Haifa, we need to go for this. And this is a voice you need to consider. David and I, we've known each other for more than 30 years, okay? We tend to dislike wars. We know what the terrible price could be. We always prefer the diplomatic solution. And yet, when I listen to some of these guys, we're not crazy. We're not speaking to Attila the Hun here. We're talking of people who care about Israel's safety and who think that lines were crossed on October 7th and that Israel needs to rethink its whole strategy and its whole military attitude, so to speak, towards the region at large. People like Ehud Barak, for instance, I don't think that Barak is suggesting a war right now against Hezbollah, but when Barak talks of an Iranian plan, conspiracy, whatever, to destroy Israel completely, he never used to talk in such terms 5 or 10 or 15 years ago. Apparently, there's more information about people around Khamenei entertaining such thoughts, and this is troubling from an Israeli perspective.
I can imagine military planners, from what I'm hearing, are also those who make the case for war are saying, look, you have an opportunity where you could turn necessity into virtue. If you're going to have a war, it's got to be while the population is cleared out. And they're cleared out now. It already happened. So if you're going to do it now. This fear of a regional war is something certainly for the United States looms very large. And for them, a war in Lebanon is interchangeable with the idea of a regional war. And I think they feel that in Israel, there's a lot more caution in certain places, but there's going to always be a debate. What do you see as realistic in terms of the Lebanon side? Is there a diplomatic outcome? Because some people say even if there's a war, there's going to be a diplomatic outcome. So just get to the outcome, but without having to fight the war. How do you see it?
Yes, correct. I agree that a war that is not going to demolish Hezbollah or weaken it to a point where they cannot actually go back to where they are today is not going to really resolve the issue or the Hezbollah risk that is going to come back. Today, it's very different from 2006, right? 2006 was a 34-day war between Hezbollah and Israel that caused a lot of damage in Lebanon, but also didn't weaken Hezbollah to that extent. 1701 was a ceasefire agreement. It wasn't really a resolution to the conflict. It was a ceasefire agreement. And today, we're looking at it again as another ceasefire agreement. But Hassan Nasrallah, there are 3 layers to this that cannot be resolved by 1701. Hassan Nasrallah said that the ceasefire will be reached as soon as the ceasefire in Gaza is reached. So we don't need another negotiations with Hezbollah in order to reach another ceasefire agreement. They will stop. The question is that, 1, how to maintain the ceasefire from Lebanon, and 2, how to make sure that Hezbollah doesn't use the time. Amos said that you had 18 years of relative peace since 2006. Yes, but these 18 years allowed Hezbollah to develop very advanced weapons, precision-guided missiles, become a regional leader of all the militias, and really strengthen themselves in Lebanon politically, militarily, and security-wise. These 18 years were what Hezbollah actually needed. So the problem today, if we reach another 1701, we reach a ceasefire, both sides will breathe. Maybe at one point we get to an extent to where like the residents will also believe that they can. The Lebanese will go back for sure. This is not the issue. But the Israelis from the north will need more reassurances. Maybe we will be able to give them these assurances. The problem is this is going to be a few more years for Hezbollah to regain their strength, to restructure their commandment sector that has been demolished, their infrastructure in the south. This is an issue. 1701, ceasefire, 1701, and border demarcation. We're talking about 3 things. Ceasefire is happening right after Gaza. 1701 or another version of it will be reached at a certain point with negotiations with Lebanon. And then the final thing is the border demarcation, which is highly unlikely now since the Sheba issue is not resolved. The problem is this is all good for Hezbollah. Unfortunately, Hezbollah is great at buying time. Negotiations without force allow Hezbollah to buy time and rebuild its infrastructure. Negotiations that are accompanied with force are more effective. And I always come back to the idea, I wrote a whole policy note about it at the beginning when the negotiations started. I think the security, the Hezbollah risk and the security risk that it imposes on Israel and on Lebanon, but mostly on Israel, because we're talking about Israel now, is not a border issue. It's not about the points on the border. It's not a border issue. It's not Hezbollah on the border. The negotiations should really take a step back and not only focus on the border. I think all sides are really focusing on the border. There will never be a secure border on the south as long as the other border is not secure. How can you really stop Hezbollah from rebuilding its infrastructure and strengthening themselves when the other border is loose? And then the weapons shipment is not obstructed. And they are allowed to smuggle in everything they need from the airport, from the port, from the borders, all points of entries they control. These are security points. These are Hezbollah points. In any near-term or long-term negotiations, I know no one wants to look at it because it's complicated, because it's about also 1559 resolution, because it's all like long-term and no one wants to think long-term. Everybody wants everything to stop. But if you don't do this, if you don't really look at the other border and look at the smuggling, then you are giving Hezbollah time to re-strengthen themselves and come back and become a real risk in a few years. And then the story will repeat itself. Unfortunately, the only solution is a long-term solution.
For our listeners who don't always know everything about 1701 and 2006, it's hard for Americans and anyone around the world to wrap their heads around the unique Lebanese situation that a non-state actor, Hezbollah, is stronger than the state. And unless that asymmetry is reversed, I don't see how you're going to get peace.
The issue in Lebanon, Hezbollah's risk is not about the border. Just to summarize it, it's about sovereignty of the Lebanese state. As long as the Lebanese state is not sovereign, then Hezbollah will control the decision for war and peace, and we're back to the same issue.
As I say, the people who fire the shots call the shots. Amos said repeatedly in this podcast, the real test is, will you get people to go back to their homes? And the whole idea of 1701 is that the state asserts itself, the Lebanese armed forces. And as you point out correctly, it's not just about the southern border area of Lebanon, but what about the ports of Beirut? What about the weaponry coming in from the eastern Lebanon and the like? I want to know, to what extent is it possible for the Lebanese armed forces, if there was all this influx of money and the money wasn't a problem, to what extent is this a resource problem? Or you say, look, it doesn't matter if they had all the money in the world. They're not committed to stopping Hezbollah. Some of them are Shia themselves. What do we learn about the Lebanese armed forces? Who's going to enforce it? NATO isn't going to come into Lebanon. Israel is not going to probably trust the United Nations. There's not too many candidates here. Who could enforce, in your view? Is the Lebanese army a candidate, or is it a non-starter?
Listen, the Lebanese army, it's not like one unit that is going to be collaborating with Hezbollah. It depends which kind of brigades and groups that you bring into the south. If you bring into the south the brigades that are under commanders who are affiliated with Hezbollah, then forget it, they will be working with Hezbollah. If you bring commanders and formations that are, and here it's not about Christian Shia. You know that half of the Christians are pro Hezbollah and work with Hezbollah. Same thing with Jews. Like Hezbollah is no longer a Shia party. It is like, it's a regional multi-sectarian party at this point. So it's really about the people who are going to control the ground. But that being said, even if you bring the most anti-Hezbollah commanders and their brigades and their leadership to the south, it's going to be limited for them to do much, because at the end of the day, if you don't provide them with the resources and the weapons to actually confront Hezbollah, they're not going to be able to do it, because we saw how Hezbollah actually confronted the army after 2006 and the UNIFIL. The casualties that the UNIFIL suffered because of Hezbollah's messages, quote unquote. So we know that even if they want to, it's going to be very, very difficult for anyone to implement any resolution. It will be a repetition of post 2006, where 1701 was implemented, quote unquote, where Hezbollah sneaked back gradually and the army sneaked out gradually, and the UNIFIL became completely useless when it comes. And at the UNIFIL, the end of the day, the 1701 and the UNIFIL mission, it doesn't have any punitive measures. It doesn't have any enforcement measures. The problem is with the resolution itself, because it doesn't give the UNIFIL any power or punitive measures. So there's no way they can do anything. So unfortunately, 1701, the way it was implemented in 2006, if the same thing happens today, no one would be able to enforce it.
I think we're hitting the nub of the issue, which is that the American diplomacy is predicated that somehow if you give enough resources to the Lebanese armed forces, you could change the balance between the state and the non-state. And that will quiet the border and will enable Israel to bring people back to their homes. What is the thinking in Israel when it comes to enforcement of a deal? Because any deal that's not enforced is not worth the paper it's printed on.
Or the non-paper it's not printed on.
Or the non-paper it's not printed on, for those of us who follow non-papers. But I believe that most listeners don't have to deal with non-papers like we do. What is Israel's view of what is enforceable? Who's going to enforce any deal? What's realistic and what isn't realistic?
So I think more than anything else, and Hanin has discussed very clearly, the situation between 2006 and 2024, it's not only a matter of the bigger picture, which is the relationship between Iran and Lebanon and Israel's balance of deterrence towards Hezbollah and towards Iran and Iran's nuclear plan and so on, everything that we've mentioned here. There's a specific issue, which is southern Lebanon, which is the area between the Litani River and the Israel-Lebanon border, which is south of it. And there, Hezbollah was not only active or present. Hezbollah recently, in the last few years, has massively gained power there. What we now know from Israeli intelligence, something that we didn't know before the war started, is how massive this Radwan infrastructure is and how Radwan was planning to use southern Lebanon as a launching pad for a similar attack sometime in the future against Israel. It depended on a decision in Tehran. It depended on whether Nasrallah wanted this or not. But Radwan is a massive enemy. 6,000 fighters, well-trained, many of them with military experience from the civil war in Syria. These are people in their late 20s, early 30s, professionals. And this is a serious deal. If this doesn't get addressed in any kind of agreement, this is an ongoing problem for Israel, which may turn into a nightmare. Again, going back to the terrible sights of October 7 on the Gaza border. We talk about enforcers, we talk about UNIFIL, we talk about the Lebanese army. Who could address this issue? Who can make Israel sure if we don't fight this, if we don't reach a decisive military victory, how do we make sure that those bases are not used for a surprise attack? And we don't trust our own intelligence community anymore after its own failure on October 7th.
But any deal, Amos, right, would have to move those 6 or 7 military bases of Hezbollah.
Yeah, but it's not only the battalions, the commando units. It's about the infrastructure. It's about the weapons. It's about the bunkers. It's about the different arsenal of rockets there. It's about the fact that Hezbollah is using so many of those houses and buildings in different villages as actual small military bases. This is extremely important. So it's not only the enforcing the actual agreement, it's about cleaning this area. This is massive and it will take time and it hasn't been addressed yet. I think I'm raising questions that maybe you're not even aware of, but this is the discussion right now among the Israeli military planners.
So is it fair to say, Amos, if I'm reading between the lines, that you're saying even if the Lebanese army could be counted on to enforce a buffer area in the south, and the deal would include the
Hanin seems skeptic.
movement of 6 to 7 of these bases, that for Israel it won't be enough? And it almost makes it sound that you're saying a war with Hezbollah is inevitable. It might not happen now, but it'll happen in a few years from now.
It's an imminent threat, and I'm not sure that the time is on our side regarding that. Hanin has mentioned that. If we look at the past 18 years, of course, Israel now has F-35s. It didn't have them in 2006. It has well-trained units. It has proven its ability to strike everywhere between Iran and Yemen to Syria and other places as well. But Hezbollah, when you compare what Hezbollah went through during those years, how it improved its capabilities, Hezbollah turned into a massive army. So if we look at the future, if we wait 3 more years, and then again, I'm not recommending a war initiated by Israel in any way. I fear the consequences. And yet, I'm more and more aware of those arguments in favor of Israeli action, considering the circumstances. It's a very big problem for the government, for Netanyahu, and it hardly gets addressed because we're so focused on what happened in Gaza and the fate of our hostages, and now President Biden's resignation from the next campaign, and so on. But these are massive issues for the Israeli planners.
On that very sobering note, I want to thank both you, Hanin, you, Amos, for an excellent discussion, really unpacking the issues for our listeners in a way that they don't usually get to hear. I have a feeling that we'll be talking to you some more. I want to thank you both for your time and thank you for joining us both today on Decision Points. Thank you both very, very much.
Thank you, David.
Our pleasure.
The more one delves deeply into the complexity of Lebanon, as was evident from our conversation here with 2 experts, one realized the issue is not about getting a deal diplomatically, but it's about enforcing a deal. Lebanon is a unique situation where the non-state actor, Hezbollah, is stronger than the state itself. And that's an asymmetry that we do not yet see being reversed because of Iran's insistence. Even if you have the Lebanese army deployed in the south of Lebanon as a buffer zone, but weaponry is flowing into Hezbollah from every which direction around Lebanon, from the sea, from the air, from the east. Having Hezbollah being constrained in the south is not enough because Hezbollah will retain military predominance and the Lebanese army will be something of a paper tiger, sadly. Until someone stands up to the Iranians and demands that the state must be sovereign and demands that Hezbollah cannot be stronger than Lebanon itself, until that imbalance is addressed, it's hard to envision that there's a long-term solution here and that the tension between Hezbollah and Israel will remain. And sadly, the idea of a war between Hezbollah and Israel will be definitely on the table. It might not happen today, it might not happen tomorrow, but it looks like it's going to happen. Believe me, I'm hoping I'm wrong, but I fear, listening on what we heard, that a war is more likely than not. Thank you to my dedicated team of research assistants at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I want to thank Sidney Helbush and Gabriel Epstein, as well as intern David Ederberg. I also want to thank Rob, Hadia, and the production team at Podville Media, and listeners like you for making this podcast possible. Please leave us a 5-star review so we can grow this community. You can find Decision Points on Apple Music, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Download and subscribe to never miss an episode. To our listeners from all over the world, I hope you listen to all of Season 5 of Decision Points.